Arc 7, The Land of the Wolves. Chapter 19, A Vexing Reunion.
The man remained motionless, sprawled out on top of the stiff soil.
He was neither dead nor asleep.
He simply closed his eyes, organizing his thoughts in silence as he adjusted his unsteady breaths.
Assembling them, putting them together, building them back. Oi, you alive?
Yeah, I'm alive. As someone called out to him overhead, he opened his eyes to see the face of a familiar man. He felt like the man was in possession of exceptional talent, since the boorish impression he gave off persisted even when looking at him upside down. Anyway, that was completely unrelated to resolving the current situation.
What happened to those guys?
They managed to pass through me, and ran away as fast as they could after they threw you out.
You better do something about that.
I can't help but feel pain whenever I look at it.
You mean this?
He sat up while scratching his head, glancing towards the side of his body, where the other man had pointed at with a finger. Just then, he spotted the thick arrow embedded into his body. If the arrow piercing his left side had been positioned slightly higher than where it was, then it might have pierced his heart. Although the injury had nearly taken his life, he had few strong emotions about it. Not just about how it looked, but also about the fact that his own flesh had been pierced.
Todd, it's not really as painful as it looks, alright? Though it'll be difficult to move for the time being. Jamal, dumbass. Who said they were worried about you?
I said it's painful to look at.
Hurry up and pull it out. Todd, you're kinda rough with wounded companions, aren't you? And...
Hearing that from his frowning partner, he reluctantly grabbed the lodged arrow. The trouble with arrow wounds was that the arrow needed to be pulled out before the flesh closed around it. Fortunately, it had only been stuck there a short time, so he was able to pull it out in one go with some exertion. For the flow of blood, he pressed a torn piece of clothing on the opening of the wound and forcefully compressed it to stop the bleeding.
Todd, so, here's the arrow just as you ordered. Now what do we do, huh? Jamal, if it's a deep wound, you should withdraw and rest.
As for those guys that got away, I'll take some people along and crush them. We'll show those bastards ourselves that they're prey.
Todd, that'd be a bad move, Jamal. Jamal, what?
The man dictating the course of action from here, Jamal, was reined in by his hand.
Todd understood why Jamal would want to pursue the fleeing enemies who had made fools of them to get payback.
But, if they proceeded with a hasty offensive move, the ones who would be met with a painful experience would be those here.
Todd, think about it.
Why exactly did those guys brazenly enter Garrow?
Considering what they themselves did, it's obvious we'd be in this city. Jamal, unless they're brainless idiots. Todd, they deliberately marched in. They went as far as to conceal an ambush outside the city. With a glance, Jamal looked at the arrow that had just been extracted and cleared his throat.
Jamal, as an experienced military man, had the ability to perceive the direction from which an arrow had been fired and its accuracy, and was able to determine from how high it had been shot. Naturally, he would reach the same conclusion as Todd himself.
Jamal, if that's right, their aim is
Todd, to lure out and hunt us Imperial soldiers who'd entered Garrow. If we abruptly chased after them with our entire military strength, or rather, if we pursued them with our small force, we'd be playing in the palm of their hand.
Which of us would be the prey, I wonder? Jamal.
Gritting his teeth in frustration, Jamal scowled in the direction their opponents had fled. On the inside, Jamal looked like he was being swayed by gut-boiling fury, but Todd knew that painful feeling all too well that was something he wouldn't say. Rather than fury, it was admiration that had taken hold in his heart.
Brazenly using oneself as a decoy, successfully taking advantage of unpreparedness to lure out a foolish opponent.
He was certainly a formidable enemy, a child of war.
Todd, I seriously fucked up, failing to kill you.
While looking the same direction as Jamal, he softly muttered that. And then, he took a breath, as if he had pulled himself together.
Todd, seems we'll have an opportunity for revenge. They'll come back, no matter what.
Jamal, when that time comes, I'll show absolutely no mercy. Todd silently nodded in approval of Jamal, stifling his anger. Then, for the time being, he would confirm this battle as a loss.
Moreover, Todd, Jamal, oh, what's with those hands? Todd's legs were stretched out on the ground, both hands extended in his direction, and Jamal frowned.
Todd tilted his head at the incomprehension. Just what it looks like, he continued.
Todd, piggyback ride. Jamal, die alone.
He shrugged his shoulders. Really, that was not a response of true friendship. Stepping strongly on the hard ground, Subaru marched forward with long strides. As he neared his destination, his restlessness increased and his ability to suppress the need to jump out from the ox cart decreased. And so, with the moment of arrival finally at hand, his body leapt forward with vigor. He felt like he heard voices trying to stop him, but they all went in one ear and out the other. Shaking them off, he headed straight for the target building.
A wooden building, noticeably larger than the rest, located at the center of the settlement.
Entering it, he drew the gazes of several people inside.
Anne. So you have returned.
Quicker than my expectations even.
An arrogant man brazenly declared, sporting an Oni mask. Saying nothing towards his haughty attitude, Subaru charged straight forward.
Letting the momentum carry him, he, without hesitation, peeled off the mask of the man who looked down on him. Letting his mask be removed with little resistance, the man's graceful features became exposed.
Grabbing the collar of that unbearable person with his demonic face, Subaru pulled him up into a standing position. Next, he brandished his fist, ready to send his fist flying into that face and... Subaru, wait. Just as Subaru was about to punch him into oblivion, his drawn right arm was forcibly stopped from behind. A tall figure, who dyed the ends of their hair red. It was this settlement's clan leader, Mazelda, who had stopped him. Wanting to complain about her action, he opened his mouth, about to say now? Of all times? However, faster than he could object, Mazelda prefaced, saying listen. Mazelda, not the face. Anything else, I'll forgive. Subaru, ORAA. Abel, HK. Receiving her unwavering answer, Subaru, after a brief moment, delivered his fist directly into Abel's stretched torso. Subaru did not know if Abel had expected to be punched in the face, but, having been hit in a location he was not ready to be hit in, the man let out a cry of pain and took a few steps back. Not all of Subaru's pent-up anger was released by just that, but... Subaru, don't think we're even now, shithead. Abel, humph, what a greedy man you are. The man picked up the Oni mask that had fallen to the side and put it back on. The man who always had something to say back Abel. Having struck the man who was the source of his damn-level pent-up anger, Subaru harshly exhaled. For he had traveled for 3+ days, taking the path back, just for this one strike. Flop, look sis. Apparently, this is the village of the famous people of Shudrak. It's in the backwoods of the unexplored regions, just like the rumors say. What a find. Medium, whoa. Amazing, big bro. Look. Everyone's abs are ripped just like me. Ripped. Big bro, ripped. Flop, mega ripped. The siblings' voiced thoughts echoed throughout the settlement. They were seemingly easygoing, no matter where they were. The duo exchanging their candid opinions were the O'Connell siblings, Flop and Medium. Caught up in the flow of things, they had been invited into the people of Shudrak's settlement. They were in the middle of the plaza, sitting atop their ox cart, surrounded by the Shudrakians who had gathered in curiosity. Their fearless attitude appeared to be a constant even in different lands and environments. Acting like big shots, they showed not a single emotion remotely resembling trepidation, alertness or anxiety, even while drawing the eyes and attention of many. However, they should become more aware of the dangers and harms to one's life and body when interacting with others. It would be more normal and appropriate to be scared, because currently, they were being surrounded by a pretty much unknown, wild tribe. Abel, you have brought back rather noisy company. Were those people required for your journey? If so, the way you and I see value is different. Subaru, I won't deny we value things differently. There's a big difference in how you and I see things. Saying that attitude of yours is really something, isn't it? Abel, ho. Sitting on the floor of the meeting area, Subaru and Abel faced off against each other, much like how they had done a few days prior. Abel had received Subaru's punch of retribution earlier, but there was no inkling of repentance in the tone of his words. Never mind wanting an apology, he did not plan on giving one anyway. However, Subaru could not ignore his comment on the siblings. That was because... Abel-san, we inadvertently got those people involved. They were kind to us when we were stuck standing outside the city. Just because of that. Abel. The reason for Subaru's anger was explained instead by Rem. Unlike last time, the meeting room had not been cleared out, and so members other than Subaru and Abel were also participating in the discourse. Next to Subaru was Rem, seated Siza-style, and their fellow travelers, Kuna and Holly. Seated next to Abel were the sisters Mazelda and Tarita. As a side note, on the topic of Lewis, she was being looked after by the person closest to her in age, Utakata. She was currently, most likely, at the ox cart in the plaza, with the Shurakian-surrounded O'Connell siblings. In any case, with their assistance, we were able to return safely. In doing so, they are now being targeted by the city's soldiers. Abel, incorrect, I shall amend that. The ones targeting us and the two outside are not the city's soldiers. They are the Imperial soldiers. The ones who serve this country have become your enemy. Rem and Subaru.
From behind his Oni mask, Abel's cold words pierced through Subaru and Rem. Hearing his dry statement, Rem could only avert her light blue eyes tiredly. To be honest, that was the undeniable truth of the situation.
Subaru understood that. However, understanding and agreeing with the truth were two different things.
Subaru, drawing the bad will of the camp's Imperial soldiers was my mistake. Their hostility is also the result of my choices and actions.
Abel, that is correct. It is the fate you tied yourself to, even before you encountered the people of Shadrach.
Subaru, I can't make excuses for that fate, because the one who made them an enemy is unmistakably me. But, the one who had to pay for those consequences should have just been me. It was true that the majority of the fault fell on Subaru, but the problem here was Abel's attitude. From the start, he should have known the danger Subaru's group would be in if they entered Garrel. He should have noticed the possibility where they were attacked after coming into contact with the surviving Imperial soldiers.
That was why.
Subaru, you ordered Kuna and Holly, in advance, to wait for us outside the city. To help us if we were trying to escape the city from pursuers. Holly, for real, you guys were in quite a pickle, you know. If me and Kuna weren't there, Subaru, your head would have been split in two by an axe by now.
Plunking down into a cross-legged position, Holly stated casually while stuffing her mouth full of dangos.
Unlike the person sitting next to her, Kuna, who held an uneasy expression, she did not comprehend the mood of the conversation. Of course, Subaru was thankful for Holly and Kuna's help. If not for their assistance, the possibility of his head having been split open back then was quite high.
Subaru, using Kuna's eyes to keep watch and Holly's bow to support us. A long-range bow and arrow snipe. It's what you'd call a combo skill with both your talents. Kuna. No one told me that the situation was that crap though.
Kuna's spiritless comment evidently showed that she harbored a sense of guilt towards Subaru's group. Saying that, however, the guilt that Kuna carried was invalid. That was because the words she had given Subaru before they entered Garrel that had been what had given him the hint he needed. Had she not advised him, the help that Holly mentioned would have been unattainable.
However, Subaru, that kind of thinking only applies to Kuna and Holly. Someone like you, who foresaw the whole thing, I'm not going to be nice to.
This was why he had made the first thing he did after coming back to be his strike of retribution on Abel. If Abel had shown any traces of self-reflection after receiving that, his feelings may have been different.
But, mostly as expected, Abel showed no remorse or even any sign that he thought he did something bad.
With his unchanging, arrogant attitude, he toyed around with Subaru's anger. Even now, the sharp stare behind his Oni mask showed no clouds of doubt.
It was as if he was about to say, so what of it?
Subaru, oi, why don't you say something instead of shutting up?
Abel, so what of it? Subaru, you actually said it.
With the aggravating response he had predicted becoming reality, Subaru grit his teeth at Abel's words and sharpened his glare. However, Abel coolly let Subaru's accusatory stare slide and...
Abel, after returning with vigor and striking me, all you can lay out are dull words of abhorrence? First off, I warned you from the start, did I not, that it would not be an easy path.
Subaru, GHH.
Abel, latching onto the closest peace and safety you could find, understand that this was the penalty for not using your head. Out of all the actions any of those defeated soldiers could take, going to the city nearest their burnt camp had the highest probability of occurring. It is common sense. Subaru, then, you should have said that to begin with.
Sitting with one knee raised, Abel's words poked unsparingly at Subaru's overhastiness.
Still, in the first place, Subaru understood his mistake and acknowledged it.
He understood that it had been his lack of thinking and actions beforehand that had caused the unfortunate sequence of events to explode and unfold. However, Abel had been aware that danger lurked and let it slide. His actions had directly benefited the enemy. If being allies or enemies was an irrelevant detail, then what he had done was equivalent to setting Subaru up in a trap.
Subaru, you knew everything from the start. The chances of us encountering the Imperial Army's survivors, the chances of us having to frantically escape. How, in all that mayhem Rem would? Abel. Subaru, anyway. You knew everything.
But you kept your mouth shut. Letting his mouth run off without thinking, words which should not be spoken almost came tumbling out. Quickly preventing himself from saying any further, Subaru concentrated his anger at Abel, avoiding to look at the face of the person sitting next to him, Rem.
Subaru was getting worked up in his flames of anger.
Towards that, Abel coldly, gazed towards him. Just how much of this world did this man see through with his penetrating gaze? And, for a person able to see through so much, for what purpose did he toy with Subaru and the others?
Subaru, answer me, shithead. Why did you let us? Able to save myself from extra work. Nothing more, nothing less. Subaru, extra work. In response to Subaru's angry biting look, Abel let out a sound indistinguishable from a sigh. When Subaru blinked at his response, Abel gently rubbed the ground of the meeting room and picked up the parched earth in the palm of his hand. Abel, fellas like you value what is seen with your own foolish eyes more than the words of the wise. The intensity of falling raindrops is more eloquent than anything that could come from my mouth. Subaru. Abel, thanks to that, you must feel it keenly. That for you, there is nowhere to run to. As he spoke, he sprinkled the dirt from his palm and scattered it. With just that action, Subaru felt an optical illusion of being terribly and clearly blocked in every direction was very much being thrust toward him. As the emperor of the sacred Valachian Empire, it was simple to manipulate others with skillful words. In front of the tough sly fox of an emperor, Subaru's complaint was no different from the cries of a caged monkey. So in reality, Subaru was just left at his wit's end. Subaru, ultimately, what is it you want to do? Abel, I have already told you my intentions. To regain what was stolen. To that end, the current empire is my adversary. It is your enemy as well. Subaru. You're telling me to cooperate with you? Abel, for the time being, I have explained I possess no reason to harm you. For the troubled Subaru, Abel's words seeped in like poison. Abel's art of conversation refused to allow for a clear answer to be grasped, and was endowed with cunning as if to mystify Subaru, but, on the other hand, it also felt as though he was attempting to test Subaru. Again and again, Abel did not make any assertions to Subaru, yet he continued to speak, telling him to think for himself, and choose what to take from it. This time as well, Abel was provoking him to rise to his level if he wanted to argue. Currently, Subaru could not rise to his same level of discussion. And His Excellency, the Emperor, was not so kind as to wait for Subaru to obediently rise to the occasion. Subaru, so, everything rests in the palm of your hand? I don't like it. Abel. Unfortunately, I hold only some people in the palm of my hand. It is because of the portion I could not control that currently, I am here, sitting upon the dirt. Subaru. In the reply to what Subaru had spit out, Abel's self-deprecation was audible. His facial expression was not visible, and the tone of his voice also did not change. Still, it seemed like self-deprecation. It was unusual, no, it was the first time Subaru had heard Abel mock himself. And it was proof that he had accepted the undeniable reality. He had allowed his own subordinates to rebel, and uncrowned emperor, ousted from his throne. Deep in the jungle, sitting upon the dirt of the Shadrakian meeting place, that situation in particular was evidence that he had made a foolish blunder for which there was no excuse. Subaru. While fixing his gaze directly at Abel, Subaru deliberated quietly. Subaru still was unaware of Abel's true intentions, as well as his own or their own plans of action hereafter. He wished not to be taken for a ride by Abel's calculations yet again, and suffer similar misfortune. Actually, what the hell was Abel thinking? Subaru certainly didn't think that Abel would go so far as scheming to bring Subaru over to his side. That he would detect such value in Subaru did not appear plausible. In spite of that, if there was a reason for Abel to keep Subaru on hand, rather than Subaru's own self, it was an interest in other accessory. Mr. The people here are truly delightful and big-hearted. I'm impressed. Subaru, Yua. Subaru gasped, right in the middle of his serious deliberation. Losing his footing at the entry to the meeting place, the figure of Flop appeared, his beautiful voice resounding through. In the middle of the meeting place, while he looked out over each face lined up. Flop, oh dear, I apologize for the late greeting. Apparently, it seems the people here are representatives of this village. Oh. Miss Cuna and Miss Holly look alikes too. Cuna, it is us. Holly, it is. Flop, oh right. I'm being rude. Smoothing down his hair with his hands, Flop briskly moved to the center of the assembly, and bowed wearing a friendly smile. Flop, allow me to correct myself, I'm Flop O'Connell. I do peddling with my sister Medium and Boatcliff. It seems for various reasons we ended up accompanying Mr., Mrs., and Niswai on an incident-filled journey to this position. From now on, everyone, I am in your care. Tarita, is he being polite or not? At Flop's vigorous greeting, Tarita wore a vexed expression. Then with a glance she peeped at the adjacent Mazelda's face. Tarita, sister, what shall be done? Outsiders are ordered to stay back. Mazelda, that's true. Well, he's a sexy man. I'll keep him in my room. Tarita, sister. Folding her arms, Mazelda decided on Flop's treatment by his face.
Mazelda's judgment by exceedingly simple logic was easy to understand, but seemed troubling to Tarita, who supported her older sister as the chief. Of course, if that alone was the basis for Mazelda's judgments, Subaru would not have been able to remain in the village, so he thought there must be more to it.
Subaru, right, Mazelda-san, there's one thing I want to check.
Flop-san is my guest, or perhaps I should say I decided on my own to bring him along. But, about making him undergo the lifeblood ritual.
Flop, lifeblood ritual?
By chance, could that be some kind of traditional welcoming ceremony passed down in this village?
Certainly, I would love to have that experience too.
Subaru, it's a traditional ceremony, but it's a bit rough to be called welcoming. Flop was looking forward to trying the ritual, but even he would likely become reluctant if he were presented with the possibility of being pitted against a witch beast. Subaru was afraid that there was a possibility that Flop's attitude would not change upon hearing that, but either way, he did not want to let it happen.
Abel, I knew from the moment we were partitioned by this thin wall, but they are a noisy bunch.
And now, the one who did not welcome that attitude of Flop's was the ruthless emperor donning an Oni mask. It was a stark contrast between the sunny warmth of Flop and the cold blood flowing through Abel. At least, the fact that Abel seemed to have no reason to like Flop made Subaru's blood freeze.
Flop, oh my! What an unusual mask. Is he perhaps the head of the village by chance?
I read somewhere that people who have special appearances have special positions. At the first chance meeting of the pair, Flop started by referencing Abel's striking appearance. Flop's conclusion from the conspicuous Oni mask was understandable, but it was difficult to deem Abel as one of the people at Shadrach. At any rate, the part about the Oni mask aside, he was culturally quite far removed from the other Shadrachians. Especially from visuals, his appearance was far too irregular. Abel, it is not a poor way of thinking, but lacks attentiveness and prudence. A moment ago, you spoke of your occupation as being that of peddling.
Flop, oh, yeah.
My sister's Boatcliff pulls the ox cart that carries our goods, and we do trade all over the empire.
We are nomadic siblings wandering with the wind. With his hand pressed to his chest, Flop responded, as if singing.
Outside the building, a voice could be heard saying, "That's my big bro," from the public square. Even though separated by a thin wall, there was a deep bond between the siblings. However, even proof of such a wholesome relationship seemed not to be grounds to Abel to warm his utterly frozen heart.
Upon hearing Flop's reply, Abel sniffed a small humph. Abel, Natsuki Subaru, you say you picked these up in the city.
Subaru, don't go treating people like objects.
To start, if I accurately express the state of affairs, a more correct representation is that we were picked up by Flopsan.
Abel, the essence is what matters. I am not at leisure to concern myself with trifles.
Nevertheless, I will first commend you for returning in this way. It was a great feat.
Subaru sure doesn't feel like praise.
What the hell are you scheming?
Frankly, Flop and Abel were a bad match in Subaru's view. For that reason, he had planned to ask Flop to wait in the square and introduce him when an opportunity arose, but Abel's reaction was unforeseen by Subaru. But then, Abel's interest was not in Flop's humanity. Naturally, it would not be the presence of Medium, who was known by the loudness of her voice alone either. As such, the answer was clear.
Abel, merchant, to what degree are you acquainted with Geralt?
Flop, that's a good question, Mr. Chief. I'm proud to say I'm pretty well known in Geralt.
At any rate, it's certain our lives would be over if we traveled too far.
Since even peddlers have to get accustomed to travel coming and going from fixed places.
Cuna, seems like a fine line between caution and cowardice, huh? Cuna let out an exasperated sigh at Flop's overflowing ever-positive self-confidence. But, listening to Flop's answer, Abel kept silent under his Oni mask. No, Subaru's ears picked up a faint sound out of the silence.
It was a small noise from Abel's throat.
Abel, how fortuitous. Quite the find, Natsuki Subaru. A peddler intimate with the city would likely happen to know a byway or two.
Subaru, oi, hold up, Abel.
A byway? What are you suggesting?
Abel, again you look towards another for answers? It would appear you fail to comprehend the purpose of my repeated interrogation.
I lack the words to label such ignorance with. Subaru.
Every single bit of his manner of speaking was aggravating, but he had no retort for Abel's words. Natsuki Subaru was too isolated and helpless to actually break off the discussion here and turn his back and leave. Therefore, he thought carefully, even if it was annoying. No, even without thinking about it, he had a pretty good grasp on Abel's intention. Just now, it was evident from listening to the interrogation of Flop.
Subaru, Abel, are you seriously?
Abel, even slow minds can happen upon the answer if utilized.
Ah, as expected of your thinking.
With trembling lips and stiff cheeks, Subaru looked back, and Abel's penetrating gaze from behind the Oni mask told of his cold-hearted plan.
Then, Abel spoke, informing everyone besides Subaru.
Abel, the fortress city of Garel shall fall. That city is necessary as our next base.
Chapter 20, Emperor/Merchant/Natsuki Subaru.
The fall of the fortress city of Garel, that was the next move in Abel's scheme. As his brain digested the contents of that bold proclamation, Subaru instantly reached a conclusion. That it was an absurd plan.
Subaru, though imperfect, it's a fortress city.
It's surrounded by walls on all sides, plus entries and exits through the gates are being monitored constantly. It's not a place where you can just say something like surrender so casually.
Abel, ho, you speak as though you have seen it. Oh right, you have.
As nothing particularly useful has been heard coming from your mouth, I had nearly forgotten.
Subaru, that sharp wit is very nice.
But, that sharpness is only usable against opponents sitting down for discussions like this.
It won't work against armed opponents.
In the middle of the meeting place, encircling the fire, Subaru and Abel glared at each other. Abel let no emotion behind the Oni mask peek through, but that just made it all the more impossible for Subaru to guess what was going through his head, leaving Subaru both annoyed and confused. Right now, the legitimate concern Subaru harbored, there was no way Abel would not have likewise realized it.
And in spite of that, he had proposed something like the fall of the fortress city. Rem, you intend to use a byway to invade the city, is that what you are saying?
While Subaru was holding his breath, a quiet voice murmured those words beside him. It was Rem's. Rem was sitting with her legs folded to one side, her light blue eyes fixed intently on Abel. It was less of a glare, and more like her gaze was peering into him. Receiving that look, that goes without saying, Abel shrugged.
Abel, as Natsuki Subaru said, the inspections imposed at the main gates of the city are the first obstacle. It is imperative we find a way to evade them to get into the city.
Rem, even supposing we got in, it looked like there was a large number of Imperial soldiers within the city.
Even ignoring the inspection, I think there would be too many enemies. Abel, HM.
To Abel, who was sorting the obstacles for the fall of Garel, Rem gave a well-reasoned objection. Abel snorted at that attitude, but on the other hand Subaru's bewilderment intensified. The source of which was, of course, the figure of Rem directly arguing with Abel. Concerning the content of her argument, Rem's position could be said to be on the same side as Subaru, opposing an assault on Garel. However, her holding that viewpoint was really too fitting. As though during her short time sojourning in Garel, she had completely made sure of that point.
Abel, Natsuki Subaru, what do you know of the difference between offensive and defensive military force in regards to battle? Subaru,
The difference between offensive and defensive military force, you say?
Like, the law of threefold attack?
Abel, the law of threefold attack. Indeed, that is a perfectly fitting phrase.
When asked, Subaru reflexively answered, and Abel nodded as if impressed.
The law of threefold attack was a theory of combat regarding military force, which stated that the attacking side should have 3 times the strength of the defending side.
This was due to the difference in the sense of objectives between offense and defense.
The offensive side must defeat their opponents, whereas the defensive side could either defeat their opponents, repel them, or just avoid the attack, which was a significant advantage. For example, in this instance, to procure Garel, Abel would have to command the Shadrakians to occupy the city, but the Imperial soldiers and guards could withdraw from the attack and barricade themselves in the city to achieve their aim. To cover for the difference for it to be possible to achieve the objectives, the idea was that such an amount of troops were needed, but Subaru, 3 times the force of the city, there's no way we could get something like that together.
Mazelda-san, how many people are in this village, give or take? Mazelda, altogether, 82 people. Including Abel and that man. Flop, it's at least 100.
Subaru, I'm not sure how you're counting men with nice faces, but it's merely 100. Though I'd roughly estimate there were more than 3 times that force in the city. Setting aside Mazelda's method of calculation, Subaru estimated Garel's military strength to be in that ballpark. The scale of the city probably did not reach 10,000 people in size, but there should be a suitable number of soldiers protecting the city's law and order to match. And on top of that, the Imperial soldiers whose camp had been torched would join them.
Those Imperial soldiers, including Todd. Subaru. Abel, at the very least, it seems you possess some fundamental knowledge in that head of yours.
Yet, the reason you held your tongue appears to be some other fear besides concern about the power differential. Subaru, it's true that there's something I fear, but it's also true that the power differential is dangerous. Subaru clicked his tongue and tasted the discomfort of having his inner feelings correctly guessed. In truth, when Subaru had heard of the plan to capture Garel, the first obstacle that came to mind was Todd. Even just the thought of facing him again was enough to make his guts squirm. Anyway, if they thought in accordance with the law of threefold attack, it was not worth discussing. Subaru, as for a means to overcome the difference in strength, I can't think of anything outside of a mighty warrior joining us or the enemy commander being fatally incompetent.
Abel, unfortunately, I do not believe we can anticipate either of those. With the Shudrak's abilities, we could scatter the masses of troops, but even if they used their numbers to surround us, we would be defeated. Furthermore, I hear the enemy commanding officer is Zik Rosman.
He is a solid and boring strategist, but he has no weak point.
Subaru, Zikr. I've heard that name.
He must have heard that name from Todd, before their relationship had deteriorated. The Imperial encampment had already been reduced to ashes, but he recalled the person in command of that military operation to be called Zikr. However, since the camp had been burned, he had thought that person had been defeated as well.
Abel, those at the encampment were common soldiers.
From the beginning, in order to conceal the primary objective, they were bestowed with minimal intelligence.
Against a small tribe, a general second class would not proceed to the front lines. Subaru, so you're saying the commanding officer remained in the city from the outset?
Abel, in truth, by doing nothing he ought to have achieved an adequate result. That plan went awry on my command.
Ah, and due to your presence, Natsuki Subaru. Subaru, GUH.
Maliciously, Abel tried to force Subaru to face the responsibility he was averting his eyes from. At that, Subaru ground his teeth and pressed his hand to his mouth. At any rate, there was a high probability that General Second Class Zikr was stationed at Geril. The Empire's upper ranks were said to be General First Class, General Second Class, General Third Class, and so on, so we could understand that a rank second from the top meant a pretty powerful person.
Subaru, so what are you trying to say?
On top of our inferior military strength, the enemy commander is a big shot counted among the elite.
Furthermore, since we poked the beehive, they'll also be on guard, right?
Abel, precisely.
Can you appreciate the weight of your responsibility? Subaru, that's not what I'm saying. Abel condemned Subaru for his thoughtlessness, but the problem lay elsewhere.
It was Abel's stance of still refusing to give up the fight, even with an abysmal chance of success.
Subaru resolutely maintained that it was pointless to even try. In the first place, Subaru, I am vehemently against fighting itself. That should have been very clear when I left here. I just want to go home with Rem.
Abel, yet, that has already proved unfeasible.
You think the Imperial soldiers in Geril are your only enemy? Are you convinced another village or town would be safe? Subaru. Abel, no matter where you go, your peace can no longer be secured.
I intended to grant you the time to fully realize it, and let it seep into your blood.
Or, is the poison still insufficient?
Abel's mocking gaze was starting to peck at Subaru's feeble spirit. Besides, as he felt pain like he was enduring great hardship, Subaru let out a long sigh, though annoying, he could not deny the truth of Abel's words. The suffering he had gone through in the fortress city had created a mental barrier inside Subaru. From now on, even if he attempted to take Rem and flee abroad, even if he went somewhere other than Geril, the same vigilance and fear would not fade. Subaru's pride had been lost in exchange for 5 deaths.
Subaru, if that's the case, what if I sell you out to the enemy? His way out blocked, and having been abused for thoughtlessness, Subaru asked the question, his face looking twisted. In an instant, the words Subaru had uttered turned the air of the meeting room tense. At the edge of his vision, he could clearly see Rem next to him, her eyes wide. However, the one he had threatened to sell out, Abel, gave a small laugh. Abel, At last, your head appears to be beginning to function normally. And yet, Mazelda, that's not up for discussion, Subaru. In the blink of an eye, Mazelda drew her dagger and pressed the edge to Subaru's neck.
Subaru gasped at her quick feet and looked up at the face of the tall tribal chief who had moved instantaneously.
Mazelda's eyes conveyed a stubborn conviction on her beautiful face, they were the eyes of a ruthless huntress. Mazelda, we've already decided to fight together with Abel.
That's the result of the lifeblood ritual. If it's the desire of the one we've recognized as a compatriot, there's nothing for it.
Subaru, I get that for me, who borrowed your strength to bring back Rem, this is audacious to say. Honestly, are you all okay with that? Mazelda seemed resolute, but Subaru's query jumped over her. As chieftain, Mazelda must personify the way Shadrakians ought to be, and could not be persuaded. Even so, the other Shadrakians could have separate opinions. The different opinions of those present, Tarita, Kuna, and Holly.
Subaru, just a moment ago, this guy also said as much. The gap in military strength is clear, and the opponent's a greatly experienced, courageous general.
From the start, you can see you don't stand a chance fighting him.
Holly, maybe, Subaru's got the wrong idea.
Subaru, the wrong idea. The first one to answer the question as Subaru searched for other opinions was surprisingly Holly.
At the edge of the meeting place, Holly, who had been listening to the conversation as she gnawed on some dried meat, fixed her eyes on Subaru, his movement prevented.
Holly, if you're talking about winning or losing, drawing back from here is also our loss. If we can't fight for our compatriot, our spirit will be stained. Subaru, a stain on your spirit, you say? Something like pride, or facing your ancestors, that kind of thing? Holly, yeah, you got it, Subaru. With a smile, Holly affirmed Subaru's words. But rather than that being evidence of mutual understanding, it was proof that they could not understand each other. Subaru also understood that there were such points of view. Things like pride and family honor, so to speak, were invisible vindications that did not directly contribute to one's physical body. Thinking those were a matter of grave concern, certainly there existed attitudes that valued such things above all else. Yet, as far as that went, it was a way of thinking that could not coexist with Subaru's belief that there was nothing more important than life. Subaru, Kuna. Tereda-san. You two share the same opinion. Kuna, I don't really think about it as deeply as Holly or the chief. Terita. I will abide by my older sister's decision. Since that is my wish. Subaru, I see. He had fished for information from the other two as well, but Subaru was not able to get his desired response. He had thought perhaps Kuna would, herself being a bit out of step with the other Shadrakians, but it seemed Subaru's hope was misplaced. Terita's complete obedience to Mazelda went without saying. As it was, Subaru was without allies, with a dagger against his neck, and it appeared the deadlock would drag on, but... Rem, Mazelda-san, please withdraw your weapon. That person has no intention to hand Abel over to the enemy. The one requesting Mazelda pull back her dagger was none other than Rem herself. Meeting her gaze, Mazelda narrowed those eyes of hers. Mazelda, are you giving me an order, Rem? You haven't taken the lifeblood ritual. I permitted you into the village on Subaru's request, but don't think that means you can backtalk me. Rem, so, that's all the more reason you should pull back your weapon. That person undertook the ritual, the lifeblood ritual as you call it, and was welcomed as a compatriot. To wound him would not be a good thing. Mazelda, Mazelda had tried to overpower Rem with her strength and insight, but her undaunted retort left her at a loss for words. In the end, she swiftly returned her dagger to its sheath on her waist. And like that, Subaru was released, and he stared intently at Rem. Mazelda, what you said just now is correct. But, if Abel and Subaru's opinions are divided again, I will side with Abel. Don't forget it. Rem, is it because that person's eyes are that of a heinous villain with fitting body odor? Mazelda, a bit of sharpness in the eyes has charm too. But I have a fondness for beautiful faces. The touch-and-go situation had calmed down, but the ending exchange was a weak conversation. In any case, Subaru was freed from the situation of nearly having his throat cut, and he gently rubbed the place where the knife's edge had been pressed to. And then he looked intently at Rem. Rem. What is it? Subaru, nothing, I'm just lost as to whether I should respond to the fact you stood up for me or to the fact you disparaged my face. Rem, I said nothing of your face. I spoke of your eyes. Then your body odor. My nose is wrinkling. Please sit further away. Subaru, this again. Met with Rem's glacial attitude, Subaru was hurt by the distance she made him sit away. Yet inside his heart more complicated confusion plagued Subaru. In reality, why had she spoken up in defense of Subaru? He did not understand her true motive. Nevertheless, maybe she disliked turning a blind eye to something illogical, or maybe it was something else. Maybe thinking that was Subaru's bias? After all, she had not unpacked at the inn in Garrel, so... Abel, our conversation was interrupted. However, even supposing you were able to evade the Shadrakian's eyes, the idea of selling me over to the enemy is futile. Subaru, good job getting us back on track. While we're at it, I'll ask. Why's that? Abel, you also spent time in the city, albeit briefly. That being the case, did news of how the current imperial capital is being governed not reach your ears? Subaru, the imperial capital you say. Ah. Right, that's right. You're. In sudden understanding, Subaru stood up on the spot without thinking. Then, as he focused on his visible surroundings, he called out Flopsan. Not having kept up with the change of affairs, the astonished Flop turned around with a yap. Flop, what is it, mister? Honestly, I'm feeling extremely confused and bewildered right now, I'm becoming a mess. I'm not following this conversation in the slightest, all I know is it feels like we're getting to the climax of the issue. Subaru, sorry for leaving you out of the loop, but confirm something for me. In Garrel you talked about the official notice from the imperial capital, or rather, about the Emperor's proclamation. Flop, the Emperor's proclamation. You mean the trouble in the imperial capital?
Flop snapped his fingers, and Subaru nodded at his understanding. Immediately after, the intense fight with Todd, having been repeated sixfold, had been severely burned into his brain, but he had also exchanged such talk with Flop and Garrel.
Reflecting on the matter in question, Flop smoothed down his own long hair.
Flop, our empire has smoldering embers, and in the capital there's some kind of disturbance happening. The current emperor has been reigning for a long time, and with no signs of civil war, imperial citizens have been enjoying peaceful days. But then this happened. Subaru, talk of trouble in the capital has spread outside, and you said the emperor himself had set out to resolve it, right?
It was a kind of unusual announcement, but... Flop, right. Actually, this is the first time since the current emperor took the throne. Nonetheless, he has an excellent track record managing the empire so far. So I'm not worried. Viva Wallachia!
Raising both hands, Flop unconsciously gouged Subaru's old wound. Those were the words extolling the empire that he had heard so often in the imperial encampment, but now Subaru did not have the presence of mind to innocently go along with it. In any case, the problem was not the praise, but the movement of the emperor that was spoken of just before. That the emperor was directly starting to move in order to suppress trouble in the capital was an unprecedented situation. Not to mention, in the event that the emperor were to do something like issuing a command before the public.
Subaru, the you that's here now, who are you and what kind of position are you in? Can you prove you aren't some crazy nutcase with a screw loose?
Abel, proof you say?
Where is the need for that?
Subaru, what? Sitting with his knee raised, Abel snorted at Subaru's skepticism. At the same time, he put his hand on his chest and, like he was trying to flaunt his own existence, spoke.
Abel, never mind the thoughtless ones who have turned on me.
Seeing as you have reached a point of no return, if you were to still treat me as an insolent person who speaks nonsense, how do you explain the situation you have found yourself in?
Subaru, that's...
Abel, cease latching onto facile ideas that cannot fool even yourself, merely to obtain peace of heart. If you exclude the possibilities that do not align together at the precise time, what is left is nothing but the truth. Abel's statement was harsh, but Subaru bitterly understood the logic behind it. The only masked man in front of him was a fake being disguised as an emperor, and Subaru and also the people of Shudrak were being deceived by his falsehoods. That kind of development would lead to doom beyond saving, and above that, was hard to believe. In reality, Abel had utilized the Shadrakian strength and the information obtained from Subaru to fight and win against the Imperial army.
That real occurrence was something that could not be explained away by a habitual liar. Subaru, then, what about the Imperial capital stuff?
If it said that the Emperor directly took command, there's no way the Emperor wouldn't come out in front of people.
Abel, I suppose they would then. A fake remarkably similar to myself.
To halt mentions of the Emperor's absence, an exceptionally well-made double is used.
Shisha Gold. Subaru, Shisha.
It was a name he had not heard before, but they were Abel's no, they were the Emperor's body double. In a land where the imperialistic might makes right ideology inhabited, it was easy to imagine that in preparation for assassinations, the Emperor would arrange for a body double.
However, having said body double be used by the enemy to usurp the seat of the Emperor was quite the misplacement of priorities.
Abel, silence, I am aware.
Subaru, right, thanks to you, we're in quite a mess. If only the Empire was at peace.
The only problem Subaru needed to have was the salty interactions from the amnesiac realm. To reunite with Emilia and the others, a journey to struggle and escape the Wallachian Empire was to unfold.
That was all it had to be.
But now, due to some fate, they were in this mess.
Flop, mister.
The one who called out to the sour-faced Subaru was Flop. Wrinkling the space between his eyebrows of his graceful face, he tilted his head at a rather steep angle and...
Flop, I've been thinking about it ever since I heard it before, but what you're talking about with Mr. Chief is a bit mysterious, isn't it? To be honest, I'm still shocked because of your joke about causing the fall of Daryl, but...
Subaru, a joke.
No, don't mind that.
Flop-san, I've been meaning to explain, but...
Flop, yes, please explain, if you could.
If not, I have no choice but to agree to somewhat accept what I hear without question. Saying that, Flop whipped his finger to Abel and poked it out towards him.
Then...
Flop, I have to agree to the absurd idea that Mr. Chief over there is the Emperor himself.
Subaru. Flop, ho ho ho? I'm conflicted if you stay silent there, mister. Thankfully, I have a reputation for jumping to conclusions. That's why I have the flexibility to change and withdraw my opinion, you know? Abel, you have done something akin to drawing improperness into art.
If they were trying to hide it, it was a conversation lacking the consideration to do so. That was why, sitting next to Subaru, Flop was able to naturally reach the correct conclusion. And, being able to do so by himself, Abel was showing displeasure at that. Putting disdain into his gaze, the one he insulted with improper was Subaru. He was pointing out how Subaru had not made any of the situation clear to Flop, having brought him into the Shadrakian settlement. However, accepting Abel's disdain was difficult for Subaru. Subaru, I'm improper? Like you could say that. First off, even I know that that's not something you can say out loud all willy-nilly. Abel, then, finish your ascertainment before bringing them here. It seems you still lack an understanding of the current situation. While being chased by enemies in Garel, the thinking time provided should have been more than enough. Subaru. Abel, putting something more important than yourself by your side, why did you give in to your thoughts? If you had no intention to line them beside yourself, bringing them back was a mistake from the start. Something more important than yourself. Being told that, Subaru thought about Rem beside him. The words that followed that also hurt Subaru like his flesh being cut open. What Abel was trying to say was clear as day. He was speaking on how Subaru had left himself exposed at a time he should have been protecting Rem. Of course, Subaru had no recollection of putting his guard down or giving in at all. However, in the eyes of Abel, whose thought process spun far deeper and farther than Subaru could, Subaru's own was severely lacking. It was never enough, and never worth considering. Do not bring back someone who could not be trusted with the details. That was how he was being criticized. Subaru thought to not involve Flop and Medium in things. Abel exposed Subaru's naive thought and coldly discarded it, saying that it was idiotic and stupid. Subaru, I. Flop, Mr. Chief. Could I interrupt this discussion for a moment? Subaru was at a loss for words, but in his place, Flop energetically raised his hand. Noisily advancing forward, he dropped into a cross-legged position with a thud and faced Abel's Oni mask head-on. Flop, or perhaps you are not the chief? How should I address you? Abel, as of now I bear no title. I have taken the name of Abel, but you may call me what you like. Flop, is that so? Then, I will keep calling you Mr. Chief, because it feels right. The lady soldiers over there don't mind, right? Mazelda, you're a sexy man. I'll allow anything. Tarita, sister. Putting aside the almost customary interaction between the sisters, Flop laughed with a "my thanks." As he did so, he strongly slapped his knees with his hands and... Flop, I'm scared because you didn't deny it for the longest time, but I want to talk about what you said before the previous thing you said. Mr. Chief, you wanted to ask about hidden routes into the city. Abel, yes, I did. Any ideas, merchant? Flop, I do. Is how it seemed I was going to answer, but apologies. If that's going to be used to attack Garel, then I cannot answer. Putting a palm forward, Flop stated so with a cheerful expression. Listening by his side, Subaru widened his eyes at Flop's plain and resolute words. Even Abel had narrowed his eyes an inch from behind his Oni mask. That was how much seriousness Flop had put into his words, even if it did not show in his tone. Abel. Flop's statement was rather wild and made him stand out, but that was not because he was stupid. He had also come to the conclusion that the true identity of the man in front of him, of Abel, was that of someone of high class and esteem. He had not been told he was right or wrong, so he figured his conjecture was close to the truth. Meaning, he had, against the presumed emperor, answered with a big no. Abel. Do you comprehend the meaning of what you have said? Flop, you are nothing but a chief, right, Mr. Chief? Of course I do. If swords were to cross, I will reject that. I want to avoid causing harm to someone with the knowledge I hold. Abel, that is a fairy tale. In reality, something like malice will attack you without considering your personal history. You would raise your fist against all of that and request for them to withdraw? Flop, if need be. Abel, even if you do, your efforts will bear no fruit. This is the land of wolves. A ghastly, freezing aura emanating from Abel's body pierced through the air as he stated that. The dreadful feeling of oppression from that was not because of their difference in strength. It manifested from the difference of their presences. Even Rem and the people of Shadrach, who would overwhelm Abel if they were to fight, held their breath and froze up. Of course, Subaru was intimidated too, to the point his breathing had become irregular. Flop was not excluded from this feeling too. However, while Flop was hit by the Emperor's dreadful aura. Flop, even in a land of wolves, sheep also live. If wolves were to come bite my buttocks, I would ride my ox cart and run away with my sister. I've repeated that over and over till this day, Mr. Chief. Abel. Even if his cheeks were frozen, Flop's smile would not disappear. That was his protest. Hearing that, the demonic aura emanating from Abel suddenly diffused. The oppressive air that had swept over the meeting area suddenly disappearing, Subaru got back the ability to breathe freely.
Nevertheless, even if he had obtained some leeway to take a breath, Subaru's heart was in no shape to return to normal. Subaru, Flop-san. Subaru called over to Flop with a raspy voice.
The smile Flop showed to Subaru as the latter glanced over to him was bright. It was close to a wry smile, but the side profile of Flop showed no sign of regret. However, even if he were to hold no regrets, for Subaru, who had brought him here in the first place, his regret would only grow exponentially. For Flop had directly opposed the Valachian emperor. Using that reason to incur Abel's displeasure, Abel could do anything to Flop as he held command of the people of Shadrach. However, contrary to Subaru's worries.
Abel. Opposing my lazy argument, I can see your belief does not waver. A troublesome one you are you not, merchant? Flop, is that right?
Even so, I acknowledge that my appearance is favorable to people you know.
Mazelda, I agree.
Pocketing his aura, Abel did not point his spear of anger towards Flop. Flop reacted to that in a way that made it unclear if he realized how dangerous of a tightrope he was walking on.
No comment on Mazelda's remark.
Abel, I shall withdraw my gratitude from before, Natsuki Subaru.
Subaru, huh?
Subaru, unable to restore a sense of peace in his heart from before, was spoken to by Abel. From behind his Oni mask, the man with a sharp gaze nodded towards the stubborn Flop and... Abel, your self-awareness is lacking, but if you were planning to bring someone, you should have brought someone more aligned to my interests. That way, things would be done without future complications.
Subaru, if it were someone like that, I doubt they'd have been kind to us in the first place.
Abel, I suppose that judgment is correct.
How aggravating.
If the earlier gratitude had been given for bringing Flop along, then the obstinance Flop had shown certainly made Abel want to retract the commendation. No way, Flop was snapping at the Emperor's authority directly. No, he should say he was eluding it like a willow. Subaru had not thought there were people who would take such a stance. Not to mention, it had also been unexpected that Abel would tolerate such an attitude from Flop.
Rem, I expected Abel-san to be more obstinate. Subaru, hold on, Rem.
Rem's brief comment seemed to reflect Subaru's heart, and his eyes widened involuntarily. In truth, he also found that surprising, but he had not spoken because he thought there was nothing to be gained by saying it. It had come from Rem, and Abel's Oni mask turned toward her. The Oni and the Oni mask faced one another, and for a moment the space between both of them yielded silence.
Abel, people with convictions are worrisome.
Strong roots spread and build up strength in the trunk.
Rem, what does that mean? Abel, you cannot tell? No matter, it is a trifle. Rem knit her brow, hearing Abel's quiet and somewhat uncharacteristic response.
Displaying some disappointment towards Rem's reply, Abel loosely shook his head.
No one knew the reason for his disappointment.
Subaru, however, could roughly guess as to what it was.
Subaru. Were you alluding to something?
Abel, that was unexpected. You do not look like the type of person to have received an education.
Subaru, I figured it was something of the sort. You sounded like you were quoting someone else. Hearing Abel unexpectedly talk like a normal person was surprising.
However, the person in question, Abel, heeded no mind in having his true thoughts revealed and answered shortly with an I see.
Abel, as for your question from before, to say it was unexpected of me, you have quite the impression of me, do you not? First off, what did you expect me to do?
Rem, I thought for sure you would at least torture them for information. Questioned by Abel, the impression that Rem left with her answer was that of being too honest. Saying that, however, it was not an option that Subaru had not considered as well. If Abel wanted to make Flop obey to his will, it would be unsurprising if he ordered the Shadrachians to torture or perform other similar things to him. Except, Abel shrugged his shoulders at those words and replied saying it is useless. Abel, certainly, there are times when pain is the best negotiation tactic. However, the veracity of the information extracted from that method is extremely low. Humans will lie without hesitation to free themselves from the pain before them.
Rem.
Abel, and were you in such a scenario, your eyes tell me you would shield them with your life. That was how Abel assessed Rem, who was motionlessly directing her stare at him. Looking at Rem's side profile, her jaw was clenched shut and her pretty features were on the verge of being wiped away by a look of grim resolve.
Her side profile made clear that Abel's brief assessment was true.
Abel, I will not risk a foolish action that may reduce my troops in exchange for information low in accuracy. Therefore, I will negotiate.
Flop, negotiate?
Abel,
merchant, I will buy any knowledge you possess. Let us negotiate for that. Abel said, while lowering his raised knee and plunking down into a cross-legged position.
Hearing that, Flop widened his eyes and faced Abel with a smile on his face.
Then, Flop, when I hear the word negotiation, as a merchant, I can't help but get excited. However,
before we start negotiating, let me get one thing straight.
I'm very stubborn.
Even if my head were to be split and smashed open, I won't comply with anything I can't agree on. Such was his declaration.
Subaru, even if your head were to be split open, that's not funny at all.
It's not funny at all, Flop-san. Recalling Flop's caustic words that kicked off the negotiation battle just before, Subaru made a bitter face. Flop did not do it purposely, but having seen his head be split and smashed open multiple times in reality, his words had the impact of a surprise attack on Subaru.
Subaru. Narrowing his eyes, Subaru looked over at the meeting area from a hill slightly away.
Even now, in the meeting area, Abel and Flop's negotiations, or business talks, were underway. Abel wanted a foothold, required for the conquest of Garrel.
Flop had the knowledge needed for that task, yet was not revealing it. That was the situation inside at the moment. The reason Subaru had left the meeting area was because it was ordered that anyone unneeded for the negotiations was to be excluded. Basically, he was ordered out by Abel. And Subaru himself could not come up with a reason for him to stay at that place. Subaru, using secret paths to enter the city, a blitzkrieg attack to go straight for the enemy general's throat. Kicked out of the meeting, Subaru savored the jungle-smelling wind as he recollected his memories. From what he had heard, the plan Abel had outlined was something like that. Although simple, it was difficult to come up with any other plan that would overcome the difference in manpower. If there was anything to change or add, it would be to attract attention in the city with a diversion, or perform little tricks to reduce the enemy general's guards. As for any problems with the plan, Subaru, simple plans are easily anticipated. At least I think so. Especially if Todd is against us. If there were no other methods of attack, then of course, the opponent would also take precautions against it. Therefore, a plan that the enemy was already taking precautions against was, in baseball terms, something like throwing a straight ball right down the middle. From the perspective of the awaiting enemy, it would be a mouth-watering, easy ball to bat. For Todd to miss the swing, Subaru could not fathom the idea of that happening. Subaru, or am I being too paranoid?
In the extreme case Todd was. If the average soldier is like Todd, then there's no chance of winning.
He did not know.
There were far too many unknowns. But he did not want that to be true.
He did not want to think of a scenario in which enemies like Todd existed, other than Todd.
His affinity with return by death being the worst had been proven by pain, having piled up the most deaths in the shortest amount of time. To think that that was the norm for the Valachian Empire was. The negotiations seemed to be dragging on.
Subaru
had at some point covered his face with his hands and shut his vision off from the world. While Subaru was staring into the black void, the voice of a girl he had gotten used to hearing reached his eardrums. He had gotten used to hearing it, but it was a voice he wanted to always continue listening to. However, that was only when Subaru's heart and feelings were at peace.
Subaru, Rem. Lowering the hands covering his face, Subaru nervously opened his eyelids.
Resting on her cane, Rem stood quietly on the gentle slope of the hill. Her gaze pierced through Subaru, causing him to go rigid. Right now, being able to stand face to face with Rem like this made his heart throb. During the days spent coming back to the people of Shudrak's settlement, Subaru had focused his anger on Abel, because his actions were equivalent to setting them up in a trap. In doing so, it could be said he was avoiding talking with Rem.
In reality, that was not wrong.
He was scared of conversing with her and finding out about her true intentions. That was why he averted his eyes from the things he did not like and attempted a makeshift solution. Nevertheless, there was a limit on how much he could run from the things he did not like.
There was a limit, and henceforth. Subaru.
Right now, he had no choice but to face himself against her eyes filled with seriousness.
Rem, Abel-san seems to be adding various conditions and such, but Flop-san doesn't seem to be budging at all.
Subaru, yeah, he's a good person. He doesn't want to help by providing knowledge that could get someone hurt. Being surrounded by the Shadrakians, he has some serious courage to be able to say that. Subaru had overseen the progress of the negotiations for a while, but Flop's stubbornness was exactly as he proclaimed. The focal point of the discussion was as expected, the casualties in the city of Garrel. People and material things. Flop had made clear that he would not compromise on both those things. Abel promised to minimize the human casualties as much as possible, but that was not enough to be the deciding factor.
Like parallel lines, they could not meet and reach an agreement. Towards Flop's stubborn attitude, Subaru also felt relief. Shunning war, he rebutted Abel head-on.
He was relieved that another person of such ilk was here, other than him.
However,
Rem, I don't think this is the type of situation where you can simply say he is a good person.
Subaru, what?
In opposition to Subaru, who affirmed himself to Flop's attitude, Rem quietly revealed her strong criticisms. Surprised at the bite of her words, Subaru unconsciously stared at Rem. Though difficult to meet face to face with, and despite his wish to avoid it, in his field of vision, Rem stared straight at Subaru. Without dropping her gaze, she continued on.
Rem, he doesn't want to hurt others with his knowledge. I understand those feelings. But, if you think about the overall situation, him included, how will he account for the casualties that will arise because he didn't share his knowledge? Couldn't you say that would be hurting others with knowledge as well? Subaru, that's just an argument for argument's sake.
Trying to blame Flop for all the casualties brought about because he doesn't talk, that's just a false accusation.
Rem, that may be right.
But, I do not think it's realistic to be constantly running away. Abel had declared that this was the land of wolves. And against that, Flop had proclaimed that sheep would run.
That was a fairy tale, was what Rem pessimistically realistically thought and said.
She was yet another person who had stepped foot into Geralt.
The tenacity and relentlessness of the Imperial soldiers seeped deep into her bones. Could they shake off that oppressive pursuit again? Under determined opposition and not vague malicious intent, could Flop, with medium, keep running to the ends of the world? And, could Subaru's group, who shared the same fate as them, be able to? Subaru, hang on Rem.
What you're saying is crazy. You also said before that you didn't want there to be a battle.
But, the way you're saying it now. Rem. Subaru, it's like you've accepted that we have to fight.
His throat trembled. Subaru was unable to get his words out properly. But, just like how it was said that the eyes could say more than the mouth, in Subaru and Rem's precarious conversation, it was not just their words that spelled out their feelings. Their gazes did too. The grim resolve that colored her eyes was the same as the one when she had defended Flop against Abel.
That was what Subaru thought. Subaru.
It hurts that I can't understand you. Seeing that attitude of hers on display, Subaru spit out the honest feelings floating in his heart. She had criticized Flop for following Subaru's beliefs, but she regarded Subaru with the same eyes she used when defending Flop, when the latter was laying out his beliefs. She had defended Subaru from Abel, but she had not unpacked at the inn in Geralt.
The interactions between the awakened Rem and Subaru were always inconsistent and one way.
From the bottom of his heart, he was happy that she had woken up. The sadness that assaulted him due to her memories not returning, he believed that they could find a way to solve that problem. Nevertheless, in the Empire, where there was nobody he could trust from the bottom of his heart, from where he had to bring Rem back to Amelia and the others, her uncooperative attitude was like a knife piercing through his leg. Every time that would happen, he would be on the verge of hunching over in pain.
Subaru. You didn't unpack at the inn in Geralt, right?
Thanks to that, we reduced the time needed to escape, but I always thought it was weird.
Rem, that was... Subaru, the average person, after reaching an inn, will relax and settle down or start unpacking their luggage.
At least, that's what I think. Of course, it's always possible that you aren't that sort of person.
But...
He did not want to finish the rest of that sentence. If he could continue averting his eyes he would, but now that he felt he could not avoid questioning Rem on her inexplicable attitude, he could not continue averting his eyes.
That was why. Subaru, but, you tried to run away from me again, didn't you? Rem. Rem's silence was piercing.
Subaru felt the blood coursing through his body.
However, a scab already peeled had no use.
Letting the blood flow, heeding no mind to the exposed wound, he could only peel it off.
Enduring the pain. Subaru, if you can't believe me, that's fine. It's painful, but I get it.
You don't have any memories, and for you, my smell reeks like that of someone unforgivable.
Also, I don't have anything to prove that you can trust me. I understand why you can't believe me and want to distance yourself from me. Rem. Subaru, but, the people waiting for you. The people who hold you dear in their hearts, are real. If you don't like me, you don't have to talk to me. I'll endure it if you bat my hands away.
But, please don't try to leave.
Rem. Subaru, I'm begging you, so, please. Please don't shut me out from your life.
His begging voice was shaking, his eyes were on the verge of tears. Whether those droplets of tears that gradually appeared were the result of his self-pity, or of his petition to Rem, was unknown even to himself.
Truly, he was just being exceedingly pathetic. It was so absurd it made him laugh.
Even if he was not given up on, it would not be surprising were he to be abandoned because of his begging right now. He continued to expose his hopeless and pitiful self in front of Rem.
It was a sight he would definitely not show to Amelia, Beatrice, or his other friends. At least, Subaru intentionally strived to not show it to his friends. Never mind if he was able to actually achieve that, that was what he had done now. Because he had decided to show his weakness only in front of Rem. However, that did not mean that he wanted Rem, amnesiac, with no one to rely on, alone in another country, to shoulder the heavy weight that was Natsuki Subaru. That was not at all what he desired. Rem. Hearing Subaru's shameful begging, Rem would not say a word in return. Nonetheless, Subaru did not avert his blurry, tear-filled gaze from her. Neither did she avert her gaze from Subaru. A brief silence enveloped the space between them. Rem, Subaru. Rem, I was not trying to abandon you. Rem said awkwardly, choosing her words carefully. That was an emotion Rem had yet to show Subaru. Not even once. She spoke to the person she should be wary of, with consideration and care. She spoke devoid of a wish to hurt his feelings. Her words did not sound like she was speaking desperately and without thinking. Her tone made him believe that. Or it could be that that was also Subaru's hope speaking for him. Subaru, are you? Relying on that thin ray of hope, the thread of hope he should not be relying on, Subaru searched for the right words. What was Rem thinking? What did she wish for? What did she believe in to put those words to her mouth? Not even knowing if he should be informed of the answers to those questions, Subaru just wanted to hear her voice more, and tried to continue his sentence. However. You. Subaru, Guo. Faster than he could continue, a force jumped at him around his waist, and Subaru's body blurred as it was launched to the side. Unable to support his body at all, Subaru was blown away, sent sprawling on top of the hill. The atmosphere from before being ripped to shreds, Subaru's head spun as he opened his eyes wide to try and make sense of the situation. Lou. Don't sit on top of Sue. That's bad. Yu tried to stop her. Lou was the one who did it. Subaru, Yu Takata. Meaning, this is. The one who ran over with an almost comical pitter-patter footstep was a slightly flush olive-skinned Utakata. And, the one who was getting her sleeve pulled by Utakata, sitting atop Subaru's chest, was the young girl who bundled her long, golden hair behind her head. Rem, Louis-chan, please come down. That person's going to get squished. Louis, you. Overriding her joyful and smiley face with a question mark, the one who craned her neck towards Rem's words was Louis. Resting her bottom on Subaru's chest, Louis patted Subaru's cheeks without a care in the world. It was, however, her carefreeness that got on Subaru's nerves in the first place. Subaru, we're in the middle of an important conversation. Get off now. Louis, AAA? Subaru, don't AAA me. Utakata, please? Utakata, I'll listen cause Sue asked for it. Yu is a good wife and a good mother. Did she understand what that meant? In any case, Utakata pulled Louis's arm to get her off Subaru's chest. The pressure on him disappearing, Subaru raised his body up on the spot. Even then, an unsatisfied-looking Louis entered his immediate field of view, and Subaru became annoyed. Subaru, in the end, there hasn't been an answer as to what you are. Sin Archbishop, the evil being, gluttony, Louis Arnab. If he were to pick some choice words to decorate the blonde girl in front of him with, he could think of many foul and uncomplimentary remarks. However, even if all those words were what correctly described her before, her current self did not match up with that. That evil girl did not save Subaru, listen to him, or carelessly laugh towards him. However. Louis, you. Louis craned her neck. Her actions until now flashed in his mind. Saving him when Rem had been choking him. She had cried out and faced the many predicaments Subaru had been through, alongside him. Even the most recent one, being Todd and his axe. The memory of her receiving Todd's elbow hit and bleeding from the nose was still fresh in his mind. Her face had no sign of the previous injury, and she acted as if that event had no negative bearing on her at all. That was infuriating in a way, but. Rem, Louis-chan. Louis, you. Beckoned, Louis quickly changed her expression into a happy one and ran over to Rem's side. As if she had learned how to jump on the cane-ridden Rem, Louis jumped on Rem with not too much force. Rem caught Louis and gave her head some soft pats. She had caught the Sin Archbishop, who was one of the reasons for her current state. She had caught one part of them, Louis Arnab. Rem, those eyes of yours. Subaru, huh? Rem, the eyes with which you look at this child. It puzzles me too. This child, she's so attached to you, and yet you. Subaru. Rem uttered while hugging Louis's small body. Subaru fell silent. Was that the continuation of her interrupted words from before?
The Rem who did not unpack it Garrel, the continuation of that would shine a light on the rest of the truth. However, despite waiting, Rem did not say another word beyond that.
She only wrapped the beaming Lewis into her chest. Subaru. What do you want me to do? Looking over at Rem, Subaru finally chose to use conclusive words.
It might have been an unfair method to make Rem give him an answer. However, if Rem were to brush aside all of Subaru's chosen words and actions, this was the only option left.
What did Rem wish for, and what did she want him to do?
He had to ask her directly. On top of that, if the answer she brought out was something Subaru could not achieve for her, then it would be that time for sure that their relationship might become unsalvageable.
Knowing that, Subaru asked her fearfully.
She held her breath for a moment against Subaru's question, and
Rem. I do not want it to turn into a battle. Said that. Subaru could accept that too.
In reality, when the Imperial Army's camp had been reduced to ashes, she thought that Subaru had spearheaded that attack and so flared up at him with a strong, threatening attitude. Rem did not wish for a war.
She did not favor it. That was no mistake.
That was why he understood that her opinion had not changed. However, just when Subaru was convinced of this fact, she added on that.
That was Rem, but I don't think we can keep running forever.
Flopsand's words are not realistic.
And Subaru, you can't agree with Abel's opinion. Rem, yes.
Quietly nodding, Rem agreed with Subaru's question. Her timid agreement, it was the sign that she held the awareness that the words she spoke were outrageous. And, of course they were. She agreed with Flop's stance on not wanting to fight, she also agreed with Abel on his stance that they had no choice but to fight.
That was an ideology that could be said to be an incarnation of opportunism.
In all honesty, even Subaru thought how good it would be if a fence-sitter opinion like that worked out.
Fighting was not desired. But fighting was an inevitable outcome. They did not want to take lives.
Yet, they were at the forefront of a fight where taking lives was inevitable.
They must confront a dichotomy that involves lives. Rem, could you? Subaru, ah. Making a bitter face, Subaru agreed with Rem's contradictory thinking.
However, to that anguishing Subaru, Rem flicked her gaze towards him. Holding Lewis's head to her chest, she directed her helpless-looking light blue eyes towards Subaru.
Subaru held his breath.
As if she quietly hardened her resolve, she
Rem, could you do something about this?
She asked as if she were clinging onto him for an answer.
Subaru.
The moment he received that question, Subaru froze as if struck by lightning.
That was a completely unreasonable question.
Compared to Subaru, who thought himself to be unfair and cowardly, this question was far, far worse. The want to not fight, the knowledge that there was no choice but to fight. A third answer that was neither of those choices.
That was what Rem wished from Subaru. Why?
Forgetting everything and anything, her trust and affection for Subaru had been lost. She also held caution and disgust because of the foul smell that surrounded Subaru. And yet, why had she asked that of Subaru? Why did Rem look at Subaru with eyes that looked like she was holding onto him?
Subaru.
That extremely one-sided, even selfish question started a fire in Natsuki Subaru. Even if he were to get angry, curse her out loudly and denounce her naiveness now, he would no doubt be forgiven.
That was how selfish the option Rem chose was. However, what grew in Subaru at that moment was a sense of duty that arose from the very bottom of his soul. Subaru, He must fight. He must resist. He knew that he must break open the present as it was now.
Evading combat, the person stopping himself from revealing his information.
Flop O'Connell. Preparing himself from the unavoidable battle, the person who would win his survival. Vincent Abel Lux. In the situation they were in now, the inevitable pathways that these two held.
The person that must find an answer, a pathway that was different from these two answers.
Natsuki Subaru. Why was that? That was because Subaru, I'm the hero that Rem believed in.
And also because he was the man that kept on fighting in this other world using only his unwillingness to give up as a weapon. It was not just his philosophy, the philosophy that did not function just because he crossed borders, that let Natsuki Subaru keep walking until today.
That was what he believed. Meeting Amelia, saved by her, the days spent running to save her.
Clutching Beatrice's hand, bringing her out of the forbidden library, his promise to be together with her. Saving Rem, being saved by her, loved by her and deciding that he would answer her faith and love. Natsuki Subaru's blood boiled as he strived to change this current, constrained situation.
Something, anything, was there nothing at all?
The days spent in the kingdom of Lagunica, the days spent since being blasted into the Valachian Empire, the people he had met, the enemies he had faced, the people who stood next to him, the people who stood opposite him.
All of them became fuel.
Think, concentrate, imagine, grasp all the possible possibilities. In this world, where anyone and everyone was more successful than him, the option that was left for Natsuki Subaru was only one: his scrappy lifestyle and shrewdness.
Then. Subaru, ah.
Hit by his uselessness, ruled over by a sense of loss, and with nothing else to do, Subaru had left the meeting area. In that Subaru's mind, a thought appeared with a flash.
Reeling in that clownish possibility, Subaru seriously considered if he could convert this thought into an actual plan. Rem.
Towards the silent Subaru, Rem's eyes quietly stared. Putting a hand on Lewis, who looked like she was about to cause a commotion, and holding Utakata back, her head tilted, so that she would not leak any words out, she stared at Subaru. Despite the fact she was not supposed to possess any memories, she stared at him with the eyes she had when she did.
As if she believed that Natsuki Subaru could reach the answer that others could not reach. And then... Subaru, Rem.
Holding a hand on his chin, Rem straightened herself at Subaru's call.
There was no answer.
She somehow understood that he did not want one. However, not noticing her reaction, Subaru quietly held his breath and continued.
Subaru, what would I do if it were up to me? I found the answer.
Lumbering, advancing with strong steps on the hard ground, the doors to the meeting area were pushed open. Looking at the newly appeared Subaru, the man donning a Oni mask flared his nose in dissatisfaction. His attitude conveyed that he had been uncalled for.
Abel, what is it, Natsuki Subaru?
A person like you, one who cannot provide a constructive opinion, has no role for an appearance. He had actually been told in reality that he was not called for, and yet, Subaru's legs did not stop. Even if he had forgiven Flop's disrespect, Abel would most likely not forgive Subaru for his, as Subaru held no reverence for him. Feeling the gazes of the faces still remaining in the meeting area, Subaru pressed his legs straight forward. Standing right next to Abel, looking down at his Oni mask up close.
Subaru, any developments? You arrogant shit. Abel. Extending his hand, Subaru forcefully peeled the Oni mask off Abel's face. Mazelda and the other Shadrakians widened their eyes in surprise at his unhesitant action.
It went without saying, but Flop too was shocked, laying his eyes upon Abel's true face for the first time. However, the other's actions did not enter his eyes.
Towards Subaru's question, Abel shifted his demonic face into a cruel expression that would run a chill up anyone's spine.
He shook his head curtly, saying no.
Abel, negotiations are progressing roughly. Contrary to expectations, this merchant is hard to crack. Subaru, is that so?
Then, since you're so terrible at being persuasive, I'll persuade him for you.
Abel, what? Abel furrowed his nicely shaped eyebrows together.
Seeing his face, Subaru looked down at Abel with satisfaction.
Next, Subaru turned to face Flop.
Because a conclusion had not been made, Flop was in the middle of arguing with the presumed emperor head-on.
Taken aback by the difference in Subaru's expression and attitude, Flop called over to Subaru, saying, Mister? Then, towards the two that held differently shaped doubts, Subaru declared.
The contents of that declaration were:
Subaru, I have a plan for the bloodless fall of Garrel. If we can fight without any bloodshed, then the two of you can agree on a plan together, don't you think?
End of chapters 19 and 20, A Vexing Reunion.